The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that, as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Welcome back to Breakdown Friday. Joseph Ward, Patrick Irvin, Professor Cartone Jones. I think Thomas Sowell think that we stupid. I think Thomas Sowell think that people don't know how to read and process information, because he's the token black for the white people, and whatever he says goes, because if you got that one black person that says it, then that's what it is. That's one of the things they use him for. But if you have studied the history of the slave trade in Africa and outside of Africa, you know damn well that none of this would have happened without the Europeans. The Arab slave trade wouldn't have happened without the Europeans. The spin that he's trying to put on it, he's trying to make it seem like this slave trade would have happened anyway. Like this is something that the Africans were doing anyway, and Europeans just came in and were just able to be benevolent benefactors of it. And it's no, all of the strife and the wars and the conflict that he named that black people or those Africans had against each other, white people was at the root of that. White people were the root cause of that. The white supremacy was the root cause of that. And it's just here go Thomas Sowell again with that afro, trying to, spitting this information. And then, it's crazy because I see black people on YouTube reacting to these videos, and they be like, oh, I didn't know this. I didn't know this. Hey, man, yeah, you want to know why you didn't know it? Because you didn't never pick up a book. If you read Destruction of Black Civilization, you would know that, okay, you got us. All black people wasn't good. Dang. Nobody knew that. Like nobody in history knew that all black people wasn't good. Dang, we never had those. We didn't know that. We needed Thomas Sowell to tell us that, right? So yes, black people were involved in the slave trade, but the root of the slave trade, the both transatlantic and the Arab slave trade, go to the Europeans and the Arabs. They were the instigators. They were the starters of that, right? Yes, African people had strife, tribalism, and even indentured servitude before the Europeans or any outsider showed up. But the way they went about involving in that, the politics in that, was vastly different before the Europeans or the Arabs showed up. And we're going to get into that, man. We're going to get into that because Thomas Sowell, man, you be wilding, bro. You be wilding. Hey, man, so, you know, I just like the way everything reflecting off them glasses right now. He looked like he ready to cook. He got his proverbial apron on, his proverbial chef hat.
Oh, yeah.
You be able to get your bowl. I got my bowl ready in my spoon because he about to cook. So,
oh, yeah.
And, you know, he's the, you know, I'm a historian, you know, Pat is a historian, but he's the historian of us. And so we want to start out with him so we can set this foundation right. So, PC, man, you heard the bull jive. I'm saying it sharp. You heard the bull jive spewing out of his mouth. So what are your thoughts about what Thomas Sowell was saying, the angle that he was trying to spin on the role of the Africans in the transatlantic slave trade and the Arab slave trade?
Well, what I didn't hear is make sure that you like, share, and subscribe.
There you go. Yeah, like, share, subscribe to this channel right now because we're doing some great work over here. Please.
All right. And get active in the comment section. So what I heard was the revisionist history of the transatlantic slave trade, where it sort of like softened the blow of what actually took place and what happened. So what, you know, you take partial truths, right? Yes, there were Africans who were involved in the slave trade, but let's not make it seem like Africa itself wasn't targeted by not just the Asians, not just the Arabs, but also the Europeans. And they had been warring on Africa for thousands of years, trying to get access to their resources. And through the benevolent nature of a lot of the Northern Africans, they saw themselves as teachers, prophets, and they lived in a land of abundance. So a lot of times they would invite those and the Greek scholars would even tell you that they sat at the feet of African teachers and African prophets before they went back to Greece and created their own folklore. So, but there was also the mixture of the race, which actually, you know, we call them the tragic mulattoes, right? And those generations of people who then weren't so loyal to the rest of the tribes that they were a part of, and so they played a role in allowing for destabilization of those nations and invasions that took place, because the Arab slave trade was first and longest, and the Arabs learned that they didn't want their children, they didn't want their women mixing with the brothers, so they castrated them in the Arab slave trade.
Yep.
And so it was a far more brutal point. I mean, to the point where, you know, it wasn't what happened when tribes had warfare. Typically speaking, if you lost to a tribe, you wasn't necessarily in bondage.
Right.
You just now you became under the leadership of that new tribe.
And you still had your autonomy.
Right. And it was literally, you blended in with the people.
Right.
So the way that he breaks it down is like, well, everybody was doing it. Well, but it wasn't to the state of the brutality of the European slave trade. And in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. And this was the first one that was specifically done based on race. The chattel slave was specifically done based on race. And it was the one that was specifically, you had baby making factories, slave making factories. Specifically down in the place we call the PG County area of like Maryland. You had slave making factories where they took the women, and this is where the whole concept around buck breaking really gets in terms of having the teenage boys sleeping with their mothers, sleeping with their sisters when she has her first period, so they can reproduce and manufacture more African slaves for the plantations, and also to sell on the marketplace. So we truly don't even know the full brutality of what happened, because it's all every single story that's been told about the transatlantic slave trade has watered down the amount of damage that was done to Black people. But when if we really want to think about it, Thomas Sowell embraces European culture.
Right.
He speaks from a Eurocentric lens. That in itself should tell you about how damaging slavery was to Black people in America, because now Black people have to we had to rediscover who we were and recreate a culture based around being a newly created species of man and woman. In terms of the mixing and blending of bloodlines and from different African kingdoms and tribes. So that in itself speaks to the damage that was done. No other place in history have a people gotten to a place where they had to throw away their history, or they had to disavow their history, or their history was stripped from them. Their religions were stripped from them. Their spiritual systems were stripped from them. Their languages were stripped from them. Even their customs were stripped from them, to the point where they pretty much were a blank slate and to be imprinted on by the dominating culture, to the point where you lost all access to your culture. There were no book burnings to destroy the lineage or the history of our past. You didn't need to. You destroyed the griots. You destroyed you punished them. You limited their ability to even learn your language for a certain amount of time. So I just think that I'm not tired of Thomas Sowell. I'm tired of that man. I'm tired of dude and the ilks of him, because they themselves are walking around ashamed of who they are, and they're trying to legitimize and justify something else, and they do so because it provides him with a lifestyle that he's gotten accustomed to. Yep. And when I say lifestyle, that includes the checks that he's gotten. That includes being able to go around the country and spew this rhetoric. It includes the ability from the right books. And the scary part wasn't he an economist?
Yeah. Yeah. Does that include knee pads and baby oil too?
He might have been at a puffy party.
Yeah.
but because we keep like this economist,
right,
is stepping out of his element.
If you know a little bit about something, you know a little bit about everything. You're an expert, rather.
Yeah, that's the part I have a problem with. Too many times they get crowned as experts. We got psychology experts. We got historical experts. All these people are experts in something other than what they supposedly, were trained in. So with that, I just land my plane, man.
I'm a psychology expert too. So
me too, shit.
but Thomas Sowell is full of it. And if you actually study history, study African history, study American history, study the history of the slave trade, like, it's not hiding that Black people around or throughout the African diaspora were involved on the European side of the slave trade. And you know, the title of the video for him is Facts About Slavery You Didn't Learn in School. Well, I mean, so people who didn't know this was supposed to teach us this. But because you know, remembering Black people, we're charging ourselves to learn this at home. Stop expecting the people at school who already don't know this to teach your kids this. You know, so I want to throw that out. But Pat, man, what are your thoughts on the spin that Thomas Sowell is putting on the history of the slave trade?
I think he's doing a real good job of taking the bullets out of a narrative that is causing white supremacy, white America, increased amount of frustration right at this current moment in time. It's not like they're really bothered or threatened, but they are like annoyed with us right now. And you know, I think he's always, like, I won't say always, but as far as I've known him, he's been somebody that's been effective at taking the bullets out of the gun, because people don't study the facts and people do think in terms of absolutes. They think North good, South bad. They think Black slave, white slave owner. Like, they don't understand that we live in a world filled with nuance. Unless they're talking about themselves, and then they understand, like, nah, but it ain't as simple as you making it. But with regards to anything else,
Black and
it's
white,
pretty simple.
It don't matter if it's black or white.
Right. That type of stuff, right? You know, and you hear it. Like, I'm glad you said that. You hear it in all of the little colloquialisms and the songs and the jargon and the phrases and all of this other stuff. When it don't matter if you're black or white, and race is only skin deep, and we all bleed red, and all of them other things. Social constructs, and everywhere around us, people are trying to simplify things that should not be simplified. They're trying to make complex things simple, and they're trying to make nuanced things black and white. And I think he does a good job at muddying the waters, which I think is his only intention, really, is to create confusion, is to like remove the self-righteousness out of it. Like, you don't get to feel powerfully right because you're not sure about this now that I've presented this. And so I think that, like, that's what his purpose is. He would say, assuming he believes his rhetoric, he would say he's trying to expose Black people to the truth so that we can stop focusing on all of the wrong things. And then you would get into this discussion with him about, well, what are the wrong things? Like, what are these, you know, right? Like, and then they say, well, maybe instead of focusing on how white people have done us wrong, we should focus on how we can build ourselves up. And then you would say, okay, well, how does what you're presenting help us do that? Well, it gets us to stop focusing on what they've done wrong. Race doesn't really matter. And then you say, okay, well, if race doesn't matter, how do you explain the prevalence of race when you start looking at demographic outcomes, socioeconomic outcomes? How do you explain that?
Oh, his explanation is gangster rap.
Right. And then, and again, he does a real good job of muddying the waters, because by saying gangster rap, now it's, well, gangster rap is a problem. But then you go into, okay, who promotes it? Who promotes gangster rap? Who's distributing it? Who's encouraging people to make it? Who are the predominant consumers of it? These are not Black people in any of those categories. But as long as he can keep muddying the waters, as long as he can keep Black people confused and unsure, like, what does it matter how many Black people own slaves if the beneficiaries of the system were white? It doesn't matter. What does it matter? How many Black? Here's a question for you. How many black people own white slaves? like that's that. Now, if you could present that, I would be like, okay, let me. But saying, nah, don't do. All right. Well, I'm glad that we know that. You know, America also had Benedict Arnold. You know what I'm saying? Like we know. Like if you go to the Holocaust, the Jews had the capos in their centers. These were Jewish. Yeah, every single population, every group has people that are looking to benefit themselves at the expense of their group. That's where group dynamics, group psychology plays in the part where if your group is powerful and my group is weak, I'm willing to sell out my group to gain status in your group. It's a survival mechanism.